Hello. Today I'm going to answer the question, what is permaculture? I have put together my own simple definition of permaculture. So, here it is. The management of an environment by working with nature to ensure the sustainable health of the environment and the organisms which depend on it. So let's look at this bit by bit. Human beings are organisms which depend on their environment for healthy food, drink, air, etc. And the environment has to be sustainable and healthy to ensure that the food, drink and air and so on are produced year in, year out, forever. There's no point in having one big glut of food and then nothing for the next following 10 years. It needs to be, as I said, every year and forever. Now, management can consist of very simple things like watering your window box regularly. But it may also be something like doing nothing. Let's take, for example, the Amazon rainforest. There, all we need to do is leave it alone. So, how do we put permaculture into practice? What things do we need to consider? Well, let's take a look. There are many things to consider, but let's just look at a few of them. So locally, we need to look at things like climate, soil, local fauna and flora, traditional best practice, and of course human factors, amongst others. With these, we can design and manage a healthy, sustainable ecosystem. So, to get more of an idea of what permaculture is in reality, let's compare some non-permaculture practices with permaculture practices to see the difference. I'm going to look at a couple of scenarios to show the differences between permaculture and non-permaculture practices. So let's imagine a scenario. We are growing lettuces in our green space and they're being attacked by caterpillars. Now, in the non-permaculture scenario, in the past, gardeners would automatically reach for some kind of pesticide to spray over the caterpillars. Now, there's a number of dangers here. As we've seen on the TV, when you see reports about farmers spraying their fields, they're often covered in overalls, they have gloves, masks, goggles, trying to protect themselves from these rather noxious substances which are pesticides. And in the garden or on our balcony we have the same problem. If we're spraying something like this, we may well inhale it, we may get it on our skin and absorb it. So there are certain health questions there when using pesticides. The other thing is, it's possibly killing the caterpillars, but it may well be killing all sorts of other organisms in the area where we're spraying. It's going to kill the caterpillars and it will also poison the food chain that follows thereon. So the little animals that feed on those caterpillars may well be poisoned too. Of course, there are going to be residues of poison on our lettuces, which we are then going to eat. So even after washing them, we may well have residues of this poisonous, toxic pesticide, which we are then going to ingest. And also, when it rains, the runoff from these plants will wash the pesticide into the soil and maybe also into the water table and into watercourses. So that's the non-permaculture way of doing things. Let's look at the permaculture way. Now, first of all, we start by the choice of plants. We buy plants which we know are going to be resistant to pest attack. And we're going to plant them in what I call a multiculture. So they're either going to be surrounded by other, for example, vegetables or other plants, or we will plant companion plants, plants which grow quite happily with our lettuces in this case. And what they will do, these other plants will actually mask the odour of our lettuces, because most pest species are actually attracted by smell. And if the smell of the lettuce is masked by other plants, then pest species are going to have great difficulty finding it. The other thing is we have an environment which is in balance. Now, what I mean by this is we have allowed the natural predators of these caterpillars to install themselves in our green space. For example, in my garden here, I have wild spaces which I leave undisturbed. I have a little pond where animals can drink. And I also allow certain wild plants to grow, which will encourage these natural predators to install themselves in the green space. So here in the garden I have lizards, frogs, wasps, beetles, birds, and all sorts of other organisms which would quite happily feed on those caterpillars. These caterpillars represent a food source, so they take care of clearing up the caterpillars on the lettuces. The other thing is, what we do is we keep certain lettuces aside to go to seed. Here the plants will go to seed, and these seeds can then be replanted the following year. And the result of this is that the plants are adapting generation after generation to the space that they're growing in, so they become more resistant, more robust, more productive. And so we have a constantly evolving situation where we have an army of allies taking care of the pests, but also we have plants which are more resistant generation after generation. We can also always think of having what I call sacrificial plants as well. We're always going to lose a certain number of plants to pests and diseases. This is normal whether you're using the most toxic pesticide in the universe, or if you're relying on our allies which are in the green space. There are always going to be losses. So I always think if I need a number of lettuces, I always grow a number of lettuces plus a few more to allow for losses, which is normal in any green space. So there we've compared the non-permaculture and permaculture methods when we've looked at pest control. So let's take a look at another scenario. My second scenario is this. We're going to look at fertilizers. Now again, in the past, gardeners, when they needed to fertilize their green space, they would go to the garden shop and buy some kind of industrial fertilizer. This would come in various forms. It could be liquid, granules, powders, or whatever. And yes, it's balanced for things like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, and have lots of micro elements in it and so on. And it's then applied to the growing area. Fine, you may say. there is again a little danger here. These things quite often wash through the soil fairly quickly. So one, their power for fertilizing is relatively short-lived, and secondly, these minerals and so on can again pass into the water courses and the water table. So that's the non-permaculture way of doing things. What do we do in permaculture? Well, we want to enrich the soil, of course, but what we use are things like compost, where we are actually recycling, could be kitchen waste, garden waste and so on, to add to the soil. Things like well-rotted manure and so on will also be used, and these will contain in various amounts the various nutrients that we need for our plants. There are other things we can do, like there's a thing called chop and drop, which is whereby we cut the plant and allow the cuttings and the things that are left that we don't use to actually rot in situ, so that they can then act as food for the following generations of plants that grow in that space. Another thing we can do, we can grow what we call green fertilizers. Now, green fertilizers are actually plants which are grown purely so that they can improve the quality of the soil. We let them grow and then they're either chopped down or allowed to die, and they will again form a kind of compost and even a kind of mulch on the soil, which will help not only to add nutrition to the soil, but will also protect the soil from the beating sun or the freezing cold, and ensure that the soil is kept moist and healthy. The one other thing with all of these methods that I've just listed in the permaculture method, they also add a thing called humus. Humus is the actual physical material that goes into the soil. This helps with drainage and conversely water retention in soils. So again, it improves the water balance in all soils and improves the texture of the soil too. So it has many, many benefits, and of course if you're recycling everything in your garden, it's also free. So there, difference between non-permaculture industrial fertilizers and permaculture fertilizers. So in conclusion, we've seen what permaculture is. It's a way of working with nature and respecting nature, and resulting in basically a saving in time, effort and money, because nature takes care of most of the work, and consequently we're not poisoning ourselves or our environment, and actually living in an environment which is diverse, healthy for today and for the future.